look at the slide on the image on the screen. What do you see here? This is a good opportunity for you to key in some comments in the chat window. What do you see here? What's happening? Give you just a little bit of think and response time here. Vortex, Katie, thank you. Yes. Yeah, you can see in the upper left-hand corner, at least on my screen, I see a field of blue. And in the right-hand corner, lower right-hand corner, I see a color of red and yellow over there. And you can see that they swirl together. Next. Next, there we go. So yeah, we've got learning science in that. And next. And we have organizational science. And you can see that to properly think about them and to have any chance at really driving student learning in a meaningful and in a way that's highly unusual in terms of the level that's accomplished, we really have to look at them and recognize that they're inextricable. Next. So yeah, if we want to really accomplish that, we have to recognize that they're inextricably connected, which means you really can't tease them apart. They're one and the same and mixed in ways that are so complete that it's hard to pull them apart. Next slide. So next. So though they're inextricable, it's really important for us to recognize that they are differentially important. So they're not though they're inextricable, they are different in importance. And so let me explain that further. In this image, take a look, and what do you see here? And based on our conversation, which of the elements of this image would you say represent student learning? And which element of this image would you say represents the organization? Just type it into the window. And thanks, Katie, and people from the Utah School of the Arts for Vortex and Convergence. What represents student learning in this image? Watching for it? Okay, so student learning is the train, and if that's the case, Railway is the organization. You're right, Crystal. If you look at that, we have to recognize that every piece and every part, every girder, every rivet, every anchor is only there to serve the purposes of transporting that train across that chasm, across that trestle. I'm assuming that those who built that recognized that that they had to have all of those pieces and had it just enough in terms of what was needed. Well, in a similar fashion, we have to be thinking about student learning in the same way. If you reflect back about what Don said, we want to have an organization that every piece and every part points to and provides support to the student learning. And if there's any piece or part of that organization that doesn't contribute, we certainly should remove it. If it does contribute, but it contributes too little with regard to its expense, then we ought to draw it out. There's a phrase that I like, which is too little juice for the squeeze. If you take a lemon and you squeeze it and it doesn't produce much juice, you put more effort into the squeeze than you got out in terms of juice. And in a similar way, if we have components and pieces of a school that you all are proposing, and there's an element that simply doesn't produce enough benefit or any benefit in terms of student learning, given the amount of expense and effort, then we ought to remove that. So I want to explore that just a little bit deeper. So next slide. Here's a reflection I had back in 2014. I want to invite you to read this, and then I'll comment on it. So that's it, right? I mean, we are preparing. What a huge job it is, and an important job. We're preparing kids for a future that we can't even fully predict yet. But what's fairly clear is that if we don't get all resources organized in such a way to produce high levels of student learning, then we simply won't arm them with the kinds of knowledge and skills that are necessary in the future to meet the demands of the environments that these students will access or need to access. One of the things that you hopefully read in our materials as far as authorization is that our mission is to unshackle the futures of students, and we do that by arming them with knowledge and skills so that they can be successful. Next slide. This is an image by Peter Senge, and what he's attempting to do here is to capture the complexity of the learning environment, learning community. And you will notice in this very complicated diagram that he's trying to reflect the multiple, the various groups that actually impinge upon or have influence in the lives of various school board members, superintendent, principal, teacher, etc. Next. You'll notice that there's arrows that go, for example, between private businesses and school board, indicating that private businesses influence school board. You'll also notice that there's a bidirectional arrow between community institutions, meaning that they actually have impact on school boards, but you'll see that school boards also have impact on those institutions. You'll recognize too that around the outside edge that there's a recognition of the influences that come from the world at large, and then from the community a little closer to the classroom and students and teachers, and then in the school, and then finally in the classroom. We feel so strongly, and in fact, that's why we led the way we did tonight, that learning happens in the classroom. It's a bi-directional interaction between the teacher, the learner, the curriculum, the instruction. All of that's happening there, and that's where learning happens, and we have to ensure that all of our resources are pointed there and that we provide the support that's needed to achieve that outcome in that setting. So I invite you to notice before we change slides here that almost all arrows eventually draw down to the teacher and then the teacher to the students, and so that's where the power is. Next slide. 2014 must have been a good year. I was doing a lot of thinking in that year. Here's another reflection from me. Read this, and I'll comment on this one. So there it is. In my 30 years in education, I've watched all kinds of different programs and supports and systems be put into place, and all with the intention of supporting students in one way or another, and particularly in their learning. We have counseling programs and school psychologists and occupational therapists, physical therapists, speech language pathologists. We have all kinds of food services, busing. But if in the interactions between students and their teachers, in the solitude of those classrooms, if nothing really changes there because of all of those other efforts, then it struck me then, and it still strikes me now, that nothing really changes in terms of student learning. So again, if we're to accomplish this, we really do have to focus our attention on the quality of those interactions that occur in the classroom, and that resources have to point and direct there and support those outcomes. Next slide. Don, Chris, and Emmy alluded to some of the work of Peter Senge, and in this particular image, what you see is two hands separated, and between them is a rubber band, and you can see that those hands are pulling it somewhat tight, and that the bottom hand represents current reality and the upper hand vision. Well, as all of you start to work towards proposing a charter school, I have no question at all that you've come to this effort with an incredible vision and frankly courage to step out and say, we want to do something much, much more for kids in terms of their learning in this world and in our state and in your community. So your vision is high. The obvious and an almost immediate thing you're encountering now and will encounter is that your current reality is separated from that vision. And so much so that there's tension on that elastic band, and between them, that creates a creative tension. And the further the vision is separate from the current reality, the more tension that will be there. Well, that's a good thing if one of two actions happen. One action actually, and that is that if we sustain our vision and we keep it high in terms of student learning, and then we find ways to impact and modify and build capacity around that current reality, and find a way to move our performance as schools, learning organizations towards that vision, then that creative tension will be a wonderful thing to draw us up to it. If, on the other hand, our response is that creative tension is too much, and we go, oh, this is just too hard. The current reality doesn't really suggest that any reasonable person would hold that vision. Then if we drop that vision, of course, the tension will decrease, and at that point, we will have not served the kids, but we certainly will feel more comfortable day to day, and our capacity won't grow to meet their needs. And so that's a concern. There's parts of this illustration that I really like, and then there's parts that I think that could be improved on. So I want to show you the next illustration and how we can improve on that. It's really our sense at the Center for the School of the Future and with our CLP partners that we sustained a fixed vision. If you look at that nail in that railroad tie, that is a spike that holds down a plate on a railroad tie. That's not going anywhere. We're going to hold that constant. And you can see that, so there's no interest in dropping that vision in terms of the work that we would be doing with you as an authorizing organization. We want to hold that firm and find ways to impact that current reality through our innovation, creativity, and just sheer effort to figure out how to turn a learning result in kids that may not have occurred before. This can even be improved upon even yet more. So the concern I had with both of the first two diagrams is that as we keep that fixed vision, and that creative tension pulls up our ability to achieve that fixed vision, then the closer we get to that fixed vision, the less the creative tension, and eventually there's not much creative tension to drive us to that fixed vision. So a tape measure seems to be a better representation of what we think around here about, and that is that we want to keep that fixed vision. We recognize the current reality, but we need consistent creative tension to draw us up. So we invite you to join with us in this perspective, and that is that we want to set high vision. I don't know how you can set a higher vision than 100% proficiency, but I think that once we achieve that, then we'll look to see what we can achieve beyond that. And I'm sure there is qualitative aspects to learning that we could achieve beyond that. So we invite you to adopt this perspective with us. It's what we're about. I started saying in the previous slide that I love the way we started off tonight. We've really tussled with whether we wanted to spend our night tonight talking with you about all the processes by which we go about our authorizing. We invited you to read those documents instead. It's our sense that we're not here to authorize schools first and foremost. We're here to drive student learning. And as a part of our effort to do that, we're authorizing charter schools and working through those processes. So we're all about student learning. Next slide, please. I love this statement. Many a cup, a slip between cup and lip. If you think about a cup of hot liquid and you take it to your lip and you slip, well, you're going to get burned. In that effort, there's many a slip between cup and lip. As we work to try to produce incredible levels of learning, there's going to be some slips between cup and lip. And I want to illustrate how easy it is to voice that you're all about learning, but find yourself off track. We see this all over. And if you look at your own actions, I certainly can discover in mine that I espouse to some things, but if you followed me around, you would discover, Forbush, I thought you were all about student learning, but you're doing X rather than Y. Let's go back to the prior slide there, Mark, if you could. So some years ago in the state of Utah, the Office of Civil Rights out of Denver came into the state, and they came in to investigate why a school district in the state had students with disabilities arriving at the school on average an hour and a half after the school bell rang. So those kids were actually being shorted in terms of their school day by an hour and a half, and there was some time lost on the other end. Some of you may know this case. Well, they came in, they found all kinds of complexities in the busing routes and schedules. They also found that because of shortage of buses, the buses had to make a round, pick up kids, and then they would head back in, drop those kids off, and then go out and get the kids with a disability. Well, the problem is, of course, is that that was an equity issue, and those students weren't having opportunity to engage and access the same amount of curriculum and instruction as other kids. And so that rippled throughout the states. Everybody was checking their busing logs to make sure that kids were getting to school on time and when the bell rang. Well, that's an example of how we can unintentionally focus on something else, but that focus takes us away from student learning. Next example. For a period of time, I was walking through a high school in the Cache Valley area, and one of the mornings that I walked through, first period, I was amazed by the length of the broadcast or the announcements that morning. So the next time I was in the building, I decided to clock the time, and was amazed to find out that 15 minutes elapsed from the time of those announcements starting to the time that they ended. And I thought at that time, wow, what are the subjects? Physics, mathematics, English? What's happening in those first hours that they can give up that much time for announcements of things that were certainly enjoyable to the kids, but were a telltale sign that though they were espousing to learning, their time was being frittered away on other things. Next. Here's another example. One of the student members of our team here at CSF and CLP tells the story of a junior high experience where his principal got a bee in his bonnet that year and thought, we've got to be the fastest school in the district in terms of getting out of the school for fire drills. So that was practiced fairly frequently. Data was collected, data was shared around the district, sounded like, and that data were actually charted and placed out for public view. And there was a real effort to try to drive down the time. Well, obviously we care about student safety, and we should. But at the same time, we have to be cautious and ensure that we only give the amount of effort and resource to those things that warrants it, and not take it well beyond that. So another example of where espousing to learning being our number one thing, but slip between cup and lip, and we're pursuing the fastest time in the district for escape times from the building for fire drills. Next. So I've illustrated some of the some examples, and you can think of some of your own. I'm quite certain of that, of where we got it wrong and our focus was stolen away from student learning. Let me give you a few examples where we got it right. Some years ago, I worked in an Idaho school district, and we had a student that was not coming to school. The principal of the building that this student attended, I was aware of how busy this principal was in his role. But seeing that this kid didn't come out, I saw that he started leaving the building and going to this kid's home. And for a week period of time, every morning he would go there, knock on the door, say, sure like to have you in school today. Sometimes the kid came, sometimes he didn't. But I can tell you by the end of that week, that kid came out to school. Well, the principal was so focused on that because what was important to him, he knew that that student's future was shackled, it would be limited, and he wouldn't be armed with the kinds of knowledge and skills that were needed if we couldn't get him out to the school where he could learn. So there's a good example of saying, this is what's most important. I could deal with discipline things here. I could go out and make sure buses are being taken care of, all important things, but he ensured that that kid got to school, and eventually he did come. Next. You know, here's another example. There's a lot of curriculum that's adopted in schools. Some of you have been part of that. If you've been part of it, you know that the salespeople bring in balloons and gifts and pens and food and just all kinds of ways to schmooze you around buying their curriculum. Well, I was exposed to a group of people who were working with a particular body of kids that were at risk, and they elected, when they were looking at a curriculum, they asked the question, what's the impact of this curriculum, if you have any research, on this particular body of learners. And so they investigated that first before they went any further. And then they wanted to know what the training program would be to help train people to adopt the program and how it could be sustained over time so that it could be delivered with high levels of efficacy to determine if it could have the impact that was intended. They also wanted to ensure that teachers had an opportunity to deliver the curriculum and make use of it. So multiple teachers used it over a period of time to then came back and spoke to how usable or how difficult it was to use. So they really went at that. And the final thing was they monitored very, very closely those lessons that were being delivered to see if it actually was bearing the kind of fruit in terms of learning that they intended for it to bear. So there's another example of making a lot of right choices and evidencing in every one of those choices that they're really in it for the kids' learning, and it's not just something that they say because it's a what educator wouldn't say it. They really did stand behind it.